Danielle Eidan from the
I'm not sure about that.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. So we're going to start the discussion on CBDC's central bank digital currencies, everybody's favorite topic. So first, I'll do a little bit of a scene setter. According to the Atlantic Council and their CBDC tracker, we currently have a state of over 114 countries that are in some level of development related to central bank digital currencies. Ultimately, this represents over 95% of the global GDP. And back in May 2020, as a reminder, only about 35 countries were exploring CBDC at that time. So there's been a significant amount of increased interest globally related to CBDC development. 11 countries have completely launched the CBDC. And we're also in a state where a lot of central banks and proponents for CBDCs are reporting alleged benefits related to financial resilience and inclusion and security in the financial system, as well as efficiencies for payments. However, CBDCs also bring great concern for many involved. They trigger a lot of concerns related to state surveillance, as well as privacy violations, cybersecurity and resilience issues, and data privacy and data privacy risk if the systems are not properly controlled. Sorry, I lost the name of all of my speakers right now, but I will just turn to everybody here to introduce yourselves. And then if you can first introduce who you are and if you've been involved in any central bank digital currency efforts underway so far. And then for the rest of the panel, we're going to discuss the state of blockchain technology and its role inside of central bank digital currency pilots and projects, how CBDCs fit inside of broader payment systems and financial systems, including cash systems, current payment systems, as well as cryptocurrency, and then finally, what the key considerations should be related to privacy and discoverability balance inside of CBDC is one of the main issues that present a lot of concerns for major privacy advocates and crypto advocates, as well as concerns for law enforcement and central bank entities that are trying to make sure compliance with anti-money laundering and other controls. So first, I'll turn it back over to all my speakers. If you'll introduce yourself and just highlight any CBDC projects or research that you've had underway. Jeff, you can start.
I guess I should take the microphone. So I am Geoffrey Goodell. I am a researcher and lecturer at UCL at University College London. And my career has been on CBDC or digital payment systems more generally for most of the past decade. And it started with the observation that basically we have a decline in cash payments as the primary mechanism by which retail consumers engage with the economy. Now, you can talk about the internet and internet privacy, but by and large, people have lots of ways, alternatives to engaging with the world that involve avoiding the internet. But unfortunately, no one can avoid engaging with the economy. So when we see the decline of cash and the decline of merchants and vendors who accept cash and the rise of online e-commerce as the primary mechanism for purchasing certain kinds of essential goods, this must give us pause. Because really here we see this structural shift away from a technology that provides essential consumer affordances, such as accessibility, custody, possession, control, fungibility, privacy in terms of not having a risk that you will be discovered, not necessarily just as someone who had transacted a particular kind of item, a good or service, but that you were in a particular location at a particular time, and that this suddenly might reveal information about your habits and might potentially be dangerous. So the work that I've been involved in has involved many different engagements with central banks around the world on most of the world's continents. In fact, I think it is actually 6 of them. And in fact, much of my work involves design of payment systems that preserve privacy, possession, and control for retail consumers. Since retail, the ability to possess and control tokens is the promise of cryptocurrency after all, but the fact that we cannot actually use cryptocurrency to engage with ordinary retail commerce is a fundamental limitation that is the result of scalability and other concerns. So mostly we have been we've been working with central banks directly, including groups of central banks such as CHEMLA and BIS, and also we have engaged in many consultations launched by various regulators, central banks, and others around the world in this topic to really address these key problems, starting with questions of the motivation and the process of CBDC, as well as privacy, custody, the role of identity in these systems, the role of the ledger, the role of the issuer, who needs to run these systems. And it's very clear from how central bank designs have evolved in the past years that many of these key questions are not yet resolved. So we still have a long way to go in terms of actually getting this into something that we can shift out of the requirements phase into the design phase. And this has been a motivating touchstone for what we plan to do as we envision the future of money. Thank you.
Thanks, Geoffrey. Really appreciate your the work that you're doing on trying to dissect and really examine some of those key policy issues that you see on for CBDCs. I'm very much looking forward to your views related to the role of identity and the right way to say for that. Chloe, will you talk to us about your work with Genesis Block, what current work is underway, and work is related to current CBDC projects?
Thank you, Carole. Hi, everyone. I'm an independent consultant. So my background relevant to this space is in financial market policymaking and regulatory supervision within government. 5 years. So the perspective that I bring to this conversation is one of policy principles and one of economic frameworks. I have a number of clients who are directly involved in CBDC pilots and projects. The projects that I'm the most hands-on with are private stablecoins. So there's two in particular that I'm working on at the moment that I'm advising. One is a fully centralized Australian dollar-backed stablecoin regulated out of Australia, and the other one is a decentralized self-pay US dollar token that is governed by the DAO and instead of contracts. So I'm very interested in the idea that like has been promoted by some people at BGIN, for example, where the CBDCs are actually a competition to privately issued cryptocurrency. And what is going to be the interoperability of point that Geoffrey's all around how the CBDCs fit in with the open source public blockchain ecosystem.
Thanks, Chloe. Really looking forward to your thoughts about how CBDCs fit in with or don't with stablecoins and other forms of payments. So thanks so much. And Linardo, will you talk to us about what works underway at the Croatian National Bank?
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Linardo Martincevic. I work for the Croatian National Bank in the government's office as a fintech coordinator and the advisor. Also lead a fintech working group in our bank and the innovation fund. But regarding CBDC, I am the representative of the Croatian Central Bank at the HLTF CBDC, which is allied task force within the European Central Bank, where we do this digital euro project. This digital euro project of the European Central Bank, where the 20 member states of the Eurozone are. So we are kind of now in an investigation phase, and we will have a new decision in October whether this project will continue or not. It's going to be decided by the Governing Council, and it most likely will. Regarding these, let's say motives, maybe I'll just say a few words, because well, there's a lot of speculation about the CBDC and these concerns that comes from losing privacy. But let's come to motives from the, let's say, central banking side. It's totally different around the world. You can't say, okay, because there's always is this a solution, search for a problem, or what it is. In terms of European Union, or better to say Eurozone, it is most likely to get something that we call the monetary angle. Today, the only risk-free, zero risk money that you have is cash. And as George mentioned, cash is declining. This is what pushed a lot of central banks to go into this project, to provide public money, to provide something which is monetary anchor, one point of exchange at par value without cost to all other forms of digital money. So you are still staying in the digital sphere, but you have a solution of public money. This is what, let's say, in a sense, drives European central banks or the Eurozone Eurozone central bank members to pursue that goal. In some other countries or parts of the world, that's not the same. Sometimes you have it, like in India or in Nigeria, it was a matter of inclusion. They wanted to get all those unbanked people to join this digital banking. This is what they at least achieved a lot. In some other parts for East Caribbean, they had this geographically dispersed area where they were like they had trouble to get cash there. They also needed one electronic point of all other currencies to join. So that was their motive. So the motives are different. On the other side, as I just mentioned, the most concerned, let's say, European Union citizens worry about privacy. There is a lot of speculation in the media about, okay, once we have this digital euro, we are going to lose our privacy, we will have a big brother and everything. So this is what we deal a lot here on our meetings for the digital euro. And we are trying to persuade the public that we are not going to see those data. It's not in our interest. We don't need them. But someone has to do the risk and fraud management. So this is kind of what is at the table now as a most complex issue.
Really appreciate that view from the National Bank. I think both you and Masaki will be able to offer some really interesting perspectives along with the rest of our panelists on the roles and the equities and getting that right balance of what the right data is that government needs versus what should be protected in all circumstances or disposable under certain ones. So now I'll turn to our remote speaker. Hello, Masaki. If you'll just introduce yourself and speak a bit to the work that you've been participating in and driving related to central bank digital currencies.
Yeah,
I think you're still muted.
yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm Masaki Bessho, head of FinTech Center at the Bank of Japan. Good morning. And actually, the Bank of Japan is one of the 114 central banks which are exploring CBDC. At this moment, we do not have any immediate plan to issue CBDC, and we see that the introduction of retail CBDC should be subject to the national decision supported by the general public. Having said that, we are enthusiastically exploring the potentials of CBDC, both from the institutional dimensions and also technological dimensions. And for about the possible motivations of CBDC introduction in Japan, we have 3 items. The first item is a possible cash decline in the future. At this moment, cash functions well as a means of payment in Japan. The amount outstanding of cash in Japan is equivalent to our 20% of our nominal GDP, and which stands out in the world. But we have demographic issues, and also we have a population drain from the rural areas to urban areas. So in the future, it might be the case, at least in some regions, cash will not effectively function as a means of payment. So if that scenario materializes, how we should continue to ensure the risk-free means of payment to the general public will be one of the points of discussions. And the second point would be the fragmentation of retail payment market in Japan. We now have a number of private services which provide payment services, and they are very convenient, and they are competing to each other. However, the point I'd like to emphasize is they lack interoperability to each other. And also, because of the network externality of payment businesses, there might be the case in the future, some kind of monopoly or oligopoly could occur in the payment market. And the final possible motivation is promotion of digitalization. And the world is changing according to the digitalization of the many economic activities, and it is important for the means of payment to address the needs of such developments. And at the Bank of Japan, we are exploring technical dimensions of CBDC through the proof of concepts and the pilot program. From 2021 to 2023, we carried out the proof of concept where we verified the basic functions of CBDC. And on top of the experiences of proof of concept, we have just started a pilot program. And also engagement with stakeholders is, we think, important. For example, we established the liaison and coordination committee of CBDC, where we invited the stakeholders. And also, along with the pilot program, we will establish the CBDC forum, where we will invite the practitioners and engineers from the private sector. And also, engagement with other central banks is, I think, important. We have a number of bilateral relationships with other central banks, and also we are a member of the group of central banks to explore CBDC, and also as a member of G7, we have contributed to the public policy principles of CBDC. Thank you.
Great update from the Bank of Japan. Now that we've talked about the current state of CBDC efforts and places where each of you are participating in and driving some of those, I think it would be helpful to kind of examine the reality of the use or role of blockchain technology in CBDC efforts. So for those of you who are directly participating in or driving CBDC work, to what extent is blockchain playing a role in implementations of CBDCs? What is the view on benefits and drawbacks?
Thank you, Carole. So first of all, let me just say that that I know that we talked a bit about privacy and possession, and let me just say on the record that the use of blockchain or distributed ledger technology is neither necessary nor sufficient to achieve privacy and possession of these assets. And let me give you some examples, right? We have systems that do use blockchain or distributed ledger technology that are highly private, highly private, like say Zcash or Monero, but they don't really allow users to have possession of the assets since they're still tied up in the ledger. And of course, there are many blockchain or DLT-based digital currency systems that are not private at all. I mean, just ask the firm Chainalysis whether ledgers are private or not in general. Now, that's not to say that we can't use distributed ledgers to build private digital currency systems. We absolutely can. But they're not necessary and they're not sufficient. We can build a highly centralized system that is also highly private, like, for example, David Chown's design of DigiCash back in the 1980s, as well as more recently the efforts by the BIS Swiss Center, Canoe Taylor, Project Tourbillon, etc. These are very highly private systems that are highly centralized as well. And the question of whether you can actually possess the asset in those systems, maybe not, but here we can see that we run the full spectrum, right? We have systems that are private that are not on DLT, and systems that are not private that are on DLT, and same for possession and control. So what is it that we really need DLT for, to address Carole's question? And the answer is really about accountability of the system operators, and about preventing the system operators from equivocating about history, and for progressive operators from changing the rules. And when we equivocate about history, and when we have the possibility of system operators equivocating about history, that immutable truth becomes mutable, if you will, then we introduce all sorts of threats to privacy and security, and implicitly the kinds of requirements that users will have for using the system. So we do need to be concerned about distributed ledger systems, but the reason that we're concerned is not directly about the privacy and custody issues. It's really about making sure that when a system operator runs the system, that it can't just change the rules without asking, which is really important. And we're not trying to say that these systems shouldn't be regulated, but we should say that regulators themselves need to be accountable if they're going to be system operators, which is a role that's different from regulators, right? So if we want to really be clear, there are financial systems in the world, such as the best execution systems of MiFID in Europe or NMS in the United States, that are really excellent examples of scenarios in which regulators oversee a complex distributed system but do not operate it. And distributed ledgers is one possible paradigm for applying that same kind of logic to payment systems and potentially to digital currency systems as well.
Thanks for that overview of reminding us that the DLT was really made for auditability and data integrity. Privacy has to come from other pieces of the equation. So Linardo, Chloe, Masaki, any thoughts about the current utility or the challenges or dangers of using blockchain technology in current CBDC experiments?
I do agree. Blockchain is not always necessary or even useful. I think the perspective that I like to bring to this question of, do we need a blockchain is not necessarily, is a blockchain, really necessary to achieve X outcome or to build X project, but to say, is blockchain implementation going to be better than the status quo? Because it is possible that a blockchain ecosystem or protocol may organically emerge as a Schelling point for demand side and supply side to come together and execute trades in a way that is much more liquid than what it is in its default state. And I see examples of that popping up. So I think it's a more pragmatic question of if we see a community, an economy emerging where they agree that this is something that they are comfortable to support them as an enabling marketplace, then I think that's a reason to be interested in blockchain. In terms of whether or not we have privacy, there's the design choices. And so I think it comes down to what are the incentives of the people building and using the system, and how clear can we be and how much can we all agree as different stakeholders in the system of what the goals and objectives are of the project. So I think it's really important to be clear on what actually are the benefits that we're trying to obtain with any given CBDC. And there's always a cost. So, what is it that we're trading off? We may decide that in some case, okay, we're willing to leverage the transparency of blockchain in order to reduce counterparty risk or credit risk. But what we're accepting therefore is maybe less privacy, or maybe it's greater technology risk, cyber risk, smart contract risk, or whatever the case may be. But I think being honest and upfront about what those trade-offs are and what the goals are that we're trying to reach is a really critical part of the equation.
Our government vets viewing the role of blockchain technology in CBDC implementations.
I mean, I could say from the Digital Euro project how it's going to be designed this. And so we as a central bankers, as central banks, as long as our mandate or central banking mandate is to issue money and to be held responsible for the issuance of the money or the currency or the legal tender, your view that we are responsible, so we will have keys. So we will know how much money is issued, and so that we could issue it or sterilize. So it's kind of a responsibility, and we have to have also some rights. But on the other hand, the idea is to have this one source of truth as a monetary anchor. Is it how the legal tender or how much of the currency is issued, and then you have all other service providers that will be allowed to attach their blockchains or DLTs or whatever to this. This regulation already exists in the European Union. You have it via DLT pilot regime, and you will also have it via MiCA, where you could issue stablecoin. So you will eventually be allowed to attach it to this one single point of truth, to just do the settlement, just do the basics, and all the rest will be left to the markets to innovate. So I see the potential here for the innovation. It's huge. It's something maybe we just don't know here, but from a central banking point of view, how much money is going to be in circulation, it is our responsibility. So this is kind of the design.
Masaki, any thoughts?
Yeah, before starting my comments on your question, I would like to touch upon two preconditions on the scope of the discussion. The first point is that I think the story might be different between the retail CBDC and the wholesale CBDC. And I understand we're focusing on retail CBDC in this panel. And the second point is in which part of the CBDC ecosystem blockchain is used. And for this point, my assumption is that we are discussing on the possible use of blockchain technology on the core ledger, where the CBDC holdings of users or intermediaries are recorded. And looking at the practices over live CBDCs or proof of concepts or pilots of other jurisdictions, it seems to me that the CBDC can either build on DLT solutions or non-DLT solutions. But the point is none of the central banks has explored the possibility of use of permissionless blockchain for CBDC. And the basic stance of the Bank of Japan is that we're open to any possible technologies that will fit for the purpose. Having said that, in our proof of concepts from 2021 to 2023, our system was built on non-blockchain solution, the relational database. And the primary reason for that selection is performance issue. Because Japan is a large economy, so in exploring potential technology for proof of concept, we set requirements for performance, for example, throughput of 100,000 TPS at maximum, and also the latency within a few seconds. And we have selected the IT vendor subject to a public tender, but we have not seen any solution based on blockchain that will fulfill this requirement. Having said that, we are much interested in the potential of blockchain for several reasons. The first reason is within the CBDC ecosystem, blockchain can be used at some part of the ecosystem. So even if blockchain is not useful for the core ledger recording CBDC holdings, it can be used for some other parts of the system. And the second point, probably that is the most important point, we think the ideas stemming from the blockchain community are quite useful. For example, the UTXO model, which is deployed in the Project Hamilton of Boston Fed and MIT, stems from the Bitcoin. And also, we have a number of these discussions on sharding or layering in the blockchain community. And also, privacy enhancement technologies and self-sovereign identities are intensively discussed in the blockchain community. And I think these kind of discussions are quite useful, even for the systems deployed on a relational database or other kind of databases. Thank you.
Fantastic overview. Oh, great. Sorry, Geoffrey has a comment.
So first of all, I think that we need to clearly err on some of the assumptions that underpin some of the modeling of distributed ledgers by central banks that have been established so far. There are some assumptions that some central banks have made about how a distributed ledger would be used to support digital currency that are just not universally true. We don't need to assume certain things. For example, we don't need to assume that the ledger we don't need to assume that we need a core ledger to record all of the assets directly. There are technologies that exist that allow assets to exist outside of the ledger and only use the ledger to record truth about transactions or updates to the assets. These kinds of technologies would involve potentially a use of a distributed ledger, but do not involve managing tokens on the ledger. And I think that many of the studies that we have seen so far that have been done by central banks, where they cite performance statistics, where they cite questions about understanding certain things about the outstanding assets and so on, are all predicated on the idea that we are using the distributed ledger for token management. And that is not the only way that we can use a distributed ledger to support digital currencies, nor should we, would be my suggestion. We can use distributed ledgers to facilitate transactions without using distributed ledgers to manage tokens. Central banks can manage the issuance and redemption of tokens entirely themselves, relying upon the ledger only to establish truth about the validity of the assets that get transferred. without actually managing the issuance or redemption or status of tokens. So I think we need to consider a paradigm shift in how we've been thinking about how we would use the ledger to support the CBDC. We don't need to use it like a UTXO system. We don't need to use it like a state transition system like Ethereum. We don't need any of that. And we certainly don't need multi-party computation or permissionless distributed ledgers in order to support a reasonable use of distributed ledger technology. And I think that what we can actually say is that if we imagine the paradigm for the use of distributed ledgers in central bank digital currency as being primarily about allowing private sector to facilitate transactions, then we're in a different place. Because if we're just using the distributed ledger as a mechanism for avoiding the central bank to become a single point of failure or a single point of truth about token state or whatever, and we instead say that tokens are issued and held off of ledgers, but that we're using the ledger to maintain validity of transactions, then I think we open ourselves up to a world in which we actually resemble something closer to the complex system of the current payments landscape, where private sector organizations operate the transaction infrastructure already, but we're able to do it in a way that allows end users to possess and control their assets and avoid the reconciliation costs of modern retail banking and so on. So I think we need to think again about what it means to use DLT in managing CBDC. Thank you.
Yeah, I think yours and Masaki's comments really are so incredibly helpful for setting the stage for the current level of experimentation, and why experimentation and research and development and understanding all the various choices and costs and benefits of those choices is critical, and why it's going to take a long time and a lot of cross-border pilots and international standards development to get this right. Across G20 nations, 3 are developing their CBDCs with DLT only, 8 with a hybrid between DLT and conventional technology, and 9 are currently undecided. So I think understanding that level of interest in using distributed ledger technologies and their CBDC pilots is critical to really look at the specific types of implementations and where it's really appropriate to use DLT based on its features. And I also appreciate, Masaki, your comments about focus on retail versus wholesale. This gets into 2 areas that are ripe for a lot of debate and strong feelings about. First, I'll ask the panelists to speak to CBDCs, how they fit or do not within the entire financial system. Existing payments as well as stablecoins and others. Do they fit? Do they not fit? Are they trying to out-compete an issue where industry is solving this problem? Are they necessary? Really, what is the role of CBDCs? And then next, I promise we'll get into the also highly debated issue related to privacy, identity, and discoverability in CBDC systems, how to get that right. But first, how do CBDCs work inside of the payment system now and into the future?
Right, so CBDCs are cash. Really, I mean, in terms of retail payment infrastructure, CBDCs are cash. And I know that when Massimo presented a Venn diagram a few days ago that showed that we have electronic money and risk-free money and central bank money. Well, now we've actually got this. We've actually got one way of thinking about money in the world. But the problem is that right now, de facto, in much of the world, including London, where I'm from, we actually have a scenario where people are using cash less and less. And what this means is that people are actually using central bank money less and less. They're actually using commercial bank money, casino chips, if you will, that are issued by private sector banks in order to conduct their everyday commercial transactions. And that has many implications for privacy, which we'll talk about in a bit, and control of the money, which we'll talk about in a bit. But it also has implications for the role of the central bank in society. Now, we know that money existed before central banks. And we also know that money will exist after central banks. It's a fundamental aspect of humanity to engage with economically with each other. The only question that we have is, will central banks be with us for the next part of the story? And if we continue on this trajectory towards using private sector money for most of what we do, the answer could be no. And that's a big risk for monetary policy and regulatory control of the economy in every nation of the world, which is why we've got this massive urgency of discussing central bank digital currency. So what we need to do is create some kind of a cash for the digital age. We need to give it an upgrade. And the reason that we need to give it an upgrade is that people are insisting upon using electronic payment methods in order to conduct their everyday transactions. And the reason for this was outlined by the People's Bank of China a few years ago, right? Think about it. Cash needs to be designed, I think, with a lot of very sophisticated security features, by the way. It's quite technologically advanced. If you look at cash closely, you can see why. It needs to be manufactured. It needs to be transported. We need to have security for all of the distribution points of banks and ATMs throughout the world. We need to have ATM machines that work and get maintained. We need to have people to service them and clean them. We need to have security cameras put in that need to be working. We need to have till infrastructure inside every retailer in the world that needs to accept cash, and they need to secure their processing of cash. They're handling it alongside of handling food safety and these kinds of things. And they also need to count it up at the end of the day and have change in the morning and take it to the bank, which requires special fees on accounts that handle cash. And all of that is expensive. Now, I'm not saying that credit with card payments isn't expensive. It is. It's worse, actually. But these are non-trivial costs, and we need to think about these costs now as we think about the role of cash in the digital age. Thank you.
If we're framing the problem as, people need assurances about the safety of their savings and their currency, and therefore the central bank needs to provide, direct retail services. Honestly, I think a CBDC is a way over the top solution to that problem. There are other policy levers that we can pull. There are other policies that have been implemented that have been shown to be effective in helping to provide those assurances. But then we have bigger questions about, geopolitics and international competition and the role of US dollars as the world reserve currency. So again, I think this really comes back to the framing of what is the problem that we're trying to solve. And I have a lot of sympathy for central banks who are hesitating on the retail CBDC question. I think there are a lot of really good reasons to hesitate on a retail CBDC. And so, whether or not these things are useful is going to depend on the starting point of the country that we're talking about. And so I want to touch on a point that was raised in the beginning of the conversation around banking the unbanked and what's happening in countries that have less reliable infrastructure and institutions. The idea of banking the unbanked has become quite a cliche and a sort of a cringe throw around term in the Web3 space. But I think we really need to remember why this is so critically important. And it's to do with property rights. If you can't reliably accumulate capital and own the capital and the value that you create, you cannot have growth. And so this is actually fundamentally an essential thing for global growth and prosperity in the fullest sense. And so in economies where it's not a reliable way to do that currently, if blockchain and DLT infrastructure can be a 0-to-1 improvement, that's something that we should take seriously and that we should explore. Is the benefit and impact of that going to look the same in Australia? No, it might be an improvement at the margin. It might be another form of fintech. And I'm a big supporter and advocate of fintech, and I think there's lots of reasons why we should be interested in fintech. But this has to be a case-by-case way of making decisions. And one thing that I really appreciate about where we've gotten to in this discussion is distinguishing between transactions of assets and the assets themselves, because that's where we get into a conversation about property rights. And that's when we start to understand the incentives that are created by different article choices. So in an analog world, if you own a physical piece of land, because you have the property right over that land, you're incentivized to create value and improve that land. And the same applies to digital land. If you are the owner of your identity or you have a bearer asset using your private key, you know that you can carry that with you for life. You're incentivized to create value around that. And so what that might look like is that you'll connect with more nodes, so to speak. You'll connect your wallet to more services. You'll build reputation on the blockchain. You can do all these sorts of things. And so pulling this back to a potential retail CBDC or something in fintech, Australia is fairly advanced in fintech. What we have is something called a Pay ID, where you can connect your mobile number or your email address to a network of people that you know socially who you can make instant real-time transactions with. And so you're adding value onto your mobile number, but you're limited to the degree in which you're incentivized to keep building and building out that graph, because ultimately your telco provider really owns the property right of that asset. So I think another interesting choice that we need to think about here is to what extent do we want to incentivize private agents and consumers in the economy to build value on top of these assets that are being issued by a retail bank or issued directly by the central bank. But then what's kind of the second round and third round effects that we want to see in the economy that stem from those initial design choices?
Great insights about the building blocks for the future of digital economies. Then the central bank views, would appreciate Linardo and Masaki's
There we
views.
go. The other side of the same side here. So how we should fit into the current payment methods. So this system, well, I think digitalization itself, it brings this network effect, which is very huge and brings a lot of concentration. Yeah. So what you get, like the winner takes it all. What you could see, as I mentioned at the beginning, the motives for the CBDC are different for different countries. I mentioned, I don't know, Brazil and Nigeria, Caribbeans, or the European Union, but for China, they had like competition problem. So this is why they issued it. They tried to do something about this concentration. So this is what happens, and we were also considering this in the design of digital Europe, how to tackle that, because if winner takes it all, maybe we will be the one who take it all. We don't want to do that. So it's kind of this is at least for the moment, it's kind of a design choice to have this sort of a holding limits. So not to squeeze out the private sector, to leave some room, or to have this, as I said, just for the main source of truth, or the place where everyone will go when the times are bad. Because when times are good, everything could be used as money. But when times are bad, then you go to your to something what you can call on. So something what is risk-free or zero risk. So this is the central banking money. I agree with the idea that public money is maybe we could consider it public good. It was also once stated from the BIS general manager, or Mr. Carstens, he mentioned it, it's really good. Maybe if we think of public money as a digital public good, something that, so the way that the money evolved over time. And maybe just the last remark regarding how to do our job if we don't have any more cash, but we need to have some communication with the general public, with the citizens. We have this digital form of money. We need to have some method to do the monetary policy, maybe indirectly in the future, maybe not, but you need to have the right tools to do your job. As long whether the issue whether the central banks will exist or not, but as long as it's within their mandate to exist, to have supply of the money under control, and the issuance of the money, they need to have the right tools to do that. If you take the tools out of them, then you just put a task on them. So that's the idea.
Masaki.
Okay, CBDC is by definition a direct liability of the central bank, and that is the starting point. And on the point Geoffrey raised, my understanding is that traditionally, in the most payment systems or networks, the entity which is responsible for the issuance and redemption of the settlement assets, and the entity which is responsible for the recording of attribution or ownership of the settlement asset are the same. But nowadays, it's not becoming true. For example, stablecoins that are distributed on public blockchains. this implies that the issuance of settlement assets and the recording of ownership of settlement assets can be unbundled. And having this point in mind, I think layering of recording of attribution of settlement assets are possible. And actually, in the proof of concept of our CBDC explorations, one of the models we developed in the experiments was based on some kind of layering, where the CBDC holdings of the end users are recorded on the ledger, which is managed and controlled by the intermediaries. And our system was based on the traditional relational database. Therefore, one point is that DLT or blockchain is not necessary for layering. Having said that, we should strike a right balance whether we will build a system on more centralized system or on a layering approaches. And there are a number of considerations we should need. For example, the performance, as I have mentioned in the previous comment, and also resilience. For example, availability of the system or maintainability of the system will be an important point. And also from the central banker's perspectives, settlement finality is really important for the stability of the economic activities. Payment should become final instantly upon the transfer of settlement assets, and it should not be revocable. This is quite important point. And of course, privacy is one of the important points we should consider. So we will need further explorations of how we should design the optimal system for the CBDC. And on the Carole's question, in our communication on our CBDC explorations, we are repeatedly saying the guiding principle of horizontal coexistence. And it has two aspects. The first aspect is the role of the central bank money in the two-tiered monetary system. And in this context, the central bank money, either central bank deposits or cash or CBDC, should function as an anchor of unit of account. And for that purpose, convertibility at par with other forms of money is critical. However, in ensuring compatibility with other forms of money, we should pay careful attention to the possible disintermediation. Therefore, in our discussions, we're exploring the possibility of introduction of some safeguards, for example, caps for holdings or caps for transactions. So at this moment, we do not have any clear answer for this question, but we will need continuous discussions on this point internally and also with the stakeholders out of the Bank of Japan. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, as you made reference to, Masaki, and I know we're also commented by everybody, this issue around privacy and identity is a critical one. It's critical not just in CBDC, it's also in all other types of cryptocurrency, but we'll focus the conversation specifically on CBDCs. And as Masaki pointed out, nobody's really building CBDCs focused on permissionless ledgers, other than the fact that a few nations have adopted existing permissionless cryptocurrencies as legal tender. But focusing on what's currently being built and that being the priority, I think I'd love to start with the government views on what is needed around privacy and identity, understanding that identity is critical in things like anti-money laundering and supporting combating exploitation by illicit actors, which would absolutely be paramount as an objective for central banks, but also understanding that privacy and unneeded surveillance and invasion of people's privacy and looking into their financial systems is also a major concern and something that that democratic regimes are generally not interested in doing. It's a really tough issue and balance when you have digital assets that can move instantaneously cross-border with significant value in systems that may or may not need to be intermediated. So I think first, Masaki and Linardo, if you guys will focus on that and maybe keep comments to under 2 minutes, and then we can turn over the comments. So Masaki, you want to kick us off since you just finished? Your thoughts on identity and privacy?
Okay. Yeah, actually, we understand that privacy is very important for CBDC ecosystem. There are a couple of reasons. The first reason is no doubt, privacy is one of the human rights, and the society should respect it. And another aspect is confidence to the CBDC ecosystem. Unless privacy is strongly ensured for CBDC system, people will not give confidence to the CBDC system, and we cannot expect adoption of the CBDC. And having said that, we are not aiming to full anonymity for CBDC through certain kind of mechanism which ensures AML CFT control and legitimate exercise of authorities that are underpinned by clear legal regulations will be necessary. Therefore, we should strike a right balance between the privacy and also the auditability for regulatory purposes. And in implementing this balance, we are thinking of dividing two parts of the whole CBDC ecosystem. The first part is the layer of plain vanilla CBDC, which is accessible for all, but it has limited functionalities, for example, pure payments. And in this area, strong privacy should be ensured, and the use of data by the intermediaries should also be regulated. And also, the access to data, user data by central bank or other public authorities should be avoided, or even if it is necessary, that should be carefully designed. But on top of that, in the entire CBDC ecosystem, we are giving private enterprises opportunities to leverage CBDC to provide additional services which will meet for the user needs. And in this area, I think some kind of data usage for these kind of services might be needed, of course, subject to the consent or understanding by the end users. And in the CBDC pilot, which we just started in April, we will have some discussions on the possible ecosystem surrounding CBDC. And in this area, we would like to have intensive discussions with the private sectors, how we could strike a right balance between the privacy and the user convenience in this area. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate both the focus on issues around balance and highlighting that privacy and anonymity not the same thing. Anonymity is a way to achieve privacy, but privacy often means that there is data that is potentially discoverable or disclosable, not necessarily all data, but what that is. So that's what the line of privacy frameworks and standards point to. I know you've got strong views, Jeff. I'm very excited to hear about them. I know we've had some fun discussion so far. Linardo, would love your thoughts about what that right balance is between data is discoverable, the role of identity in the CBDC ecosystem. How is your central bank considering looking at that?
So it's not only anonymity and privacy, but there's also the levels of privacy that we have. So we could rate it like a bit longer in the long perspective. So from a central banking point of view, as Bessho mentioned as well, we have a really Privacy is the main fundamental right. And you had it, there was this report from the European Central Bank in 2020. It was a survey for the citizens, and they were mostly concerned about the privacy in this maybe future potential digital euro ecosystem. So we take this very seriously, and this is why everything is designed around how to build it and to maintain the unity. It's not possible at the highest level of privacy, because central banks are not designed to deal directly with the citizens, with the end users. We were thinking of once when this all started, is it going to be two-tier or one-tier system? Are we going to be the ones, hello, okay, this is, I don't know, Jeff, I lost my pen, could you help me? Okay, Jeff, give me a credential. Are we going to do that, or is it someone else going to do this? So it's kind of really tricky to find out here. And on the other hand, we are now thinking of design. We still need to be responsible in the end. We need to provide trust and confidence in the system. Central banks can't fail. The others can, but we cannot. We are the ultimate risk takers. We are the ones who will take all the blame. So we have to make it really safe and strong and everything. So we need to design it in a way not to fail. So this is kind of how to do the fraud management, risk management without knowing maybe even some of the data. So it's kind of a struggle here, and we are trying to find the right solution. This was the main focus of the discussion 15 days ago at the Digital Euro meeting. Yes.
I appreciate that. The idea that safety means sometimes that that risk management doesn't mean risk elimination. It's a balance, and that safety being built into the systems means that at times there is some data that is discoverable and usable to provide recourse for victims in the ecosystems, and the great weight of responsibility that puts on central banks. Thank you, Linardo. Then turn over to the industry and academic reps. Chloe, will you kick us off with your thoughts about identity and privacy?
Yes, Carole, you said something really important yesterday about leveraging the technology to solve policy problems rather than just seeing the technology as a problem. And I really want to emphasize the point again in this discussion. We're so lucky that we have researchers in this space who are building up the academic literature on how you can take zero knowledge proofs and use them for KYC. You can actually have AML in DeFi. We have all these win-wins that we can look for, and I think that's the attitude that we need to be bringing to this challenge. It's not necessarily always going to be the case that we have these centralized dictators battling against, crypto anarchists. We can actually help drive everybody forward if we see that actually a lot of the technology and the open standards exist, but we need companies like Solviers to lead us in this space and show us how we actually take those open standards and integrate them into centralized systems. So I think there's definitely a lot of promising research and also pilots and proofs of concept where people who have that vision and know what's possible can explore this a little bit further, but we really need there to be space for those leaders to actually show us the way, because my concern is that there are still too many people working on these issues who see it as being a trade-off that actually it can be a win-win.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Carole. So there's a lot to respond to here, and where do I begin? So really, I would suggest that first of all, the use of responding to what Masaki had said previously in his penultimate comment was that this question about circulation and this idea that we can potentially know how much and how fast who actually owns the assets, the holdings. I guess this is really what Masaki said, knowing the holdings of assets. Well, as it turns out, the reason that we know holdings of assets is because we're thinking about bank deposits. We're actually thinking about not the central bank money. So I'm a bit confused when we hear central bankers talking about knowing the holdings of assets, because actually that's the domain of private sector banks and commercial bank money, which is to say the casino chips, if you will. So that mystifies me a little bit, because really, if we look at cash and we look at the complex system that cash is and has evolved over millennia, we know that central banks don't know the holdings of cash, and that's a good thing. So when we think about this as holdings, I think that we should reconsider what architectures are possible. And in particular, we can design this as Masaki says, in a two-tier way where transactions are processed by private sector entities and issuance is completely managed and redemption is completely managed by the central bank. We can absolutely do that, but we don't need to worry about holdings. We don't need to record holdings on a ledger, private or not. We don't need to centralize or not. We actually can have assets that are transferable directly by users and possessible directly by users. And with an architecture like this, we can achieve instant settlement. We don't need all of the transactions to lodge themselves on a ledger that can be browsed or not, or worry about the privacy on that or not. We can actually isolate this if we move away from the assumption that we need to track holdings, because that is a very dangerous assumption. Responding to what Chloe had said earlier about accumulating capital and building reputations, this is actually really dangerous. And I think that Chloe, being from Australia, perhaps you remember the Australian cashless welfare card. And the Australian cashless welfare card, to provide some context, was a mechanism that was used to provide government support for Aboriginal Australians, principally in order to give them a way that would allow them to pay for things. But it restricted what they could buy. It was saying, well, hey, here's some money, but it's not really money. And this raised very serious human rights questions in Australia when people asked, well, do you not trust poorer citizens with cash? Is cash too powerful? This is a really serious concern, especially when people wanted to buy things that they thought were legitimate, but the Australian government didn't, or whatever. There were debates about this, and this was problematic. So let's understand that it's really worrisome when we try to build restrictions on how people can engage with the economy for human rights issues, but also for the fragmentation of money, which, by the way, is already here. Another thing that I think is really important is building reputations. Like this is something that comes up in the context of international development. So many times people argue, oh, well, people in this part of the developing world should have a way of building credit because they need access to banking and credit and insurance services and so on. I think that's a problem. This is a really dangerous question. Like, can we really serve the interests of populations in the developing world by giving them more credit or insurance? This is actually not so obvious. And this idea that we want to track how people are transacting, how people are paying as a means of assessing whether they're good enough people or not, does sound like colonialism to me. So I think that we need to reconsider whether it makes sense for people to build reputations. Now, another thing that came up that Carole mentioned was cross-border payments and stuff. When we're talking about CBDC, let's be really careful to isolate our conversations about domestic retail payments from cross-border payments, which might have other regulatory controls. And let's also consider that we can create privacy-enhancing, privacy-enabling, privacy-enhancing digital currency systems that protect the rights of consumers absolutely, without assuming that there are no regulatory controls. We can absolutely impose regulatory controls on who receives money. We can absolutely impose regulatory controls on how the money was received. And we can also impose regulatory controls at other layers in the stack. For example, if you are a car dealership, or if you are a flight school, perhaps you are going to be regulated at a different level that requires you to collect identity information. And we should not necessarily be leveraging the banks as the identity provider of last resort, which seems to have become the identity provider of first resort. And indeed, this question of whether we need to have limits on holdings, this is something that Linardo mentioned. And Linardo said something really important that I think we should remember, that we should think about very carefully. He said, consider the interests of the private sector. Let's not squeeze out the private sector. Well, this idea of limits on wallets is, I would suggest, and perhaps this harkens back to what Massimo said 2 days ago. This is about a private sector interest. The idea that we need to limit the size of wallets and manage wallets the way that we manage accounts, because a wallet that is managed in such a way is an account. It is a relationship with a third party, whether you carry it in your pocket or not. This point is that there are parties who stand to be challenged. Their business models stand to be challenged by the advent of CBDC. And these parties include card payment networks, for example, like Visa and MasterCard. We're not saying that the companies themselves are going to go out of business, but the particular business model that they rely on is being challenged. And we don't actually need limits on holdings in order to impose effective limits on bank runs or effective limits on what might go wrong in a crisis. For example, the cost of credit changing and so on. We don't need limits on holdings for that. We can actually have limits on withdrawals, and that would be sufficient. And we can leverage limits the same way we do with cash, but better, because we can do it instantly. We can change, we can lever it up, we can turn it up, turn it down in terms of how much people can withdraw from their banks if we use the cash model for what CBDC could be. But that's not necessarily what people have been proposing. So people assume, oh, we need to have limits on the wallets. Well, actually, we don't. And these are really essential. So I think what we really need for privacy is we need to affirm certain consumer rights. We need to affirm the rights of consumers, and governments should do this, by the way. I'm suggesting to all you legislators out there, we should affirm the rights of consumers to engage with the economy without providing ID or without exposing a registered identity when they do, as consumers. Full stop. Because this is the right that consumers have always had for millennia in engaging with economies when they use cash. And this is something that we need to affirm, because otherwise, if we're not affirming it, then we are de facto taking it away. And that does not mean a fully, as Carole mentioned, a fully anonymous system. Well, really, we don't need the system to be fully anonymous in the sense of having both the sender and the recipient of every transaction be anonymous. No, it's sufficient actually to have only one party to be anonymous. And we can call that semi-anonymous if you like. But the idea is that the payer, in most cases, needs to be anonymous if the payer is to have the human rights that we've always had with cash. So I think that there are systems that we can design that have that characteristic, and we should not confuse those systems with systems that are completely outside the view of regulators. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, and thanks to the whole panel. Some really critical issues being examined here, all worthy of their own sessions or workshops, whether focusing on things like whether CBDCs are useful only as a cash substitute, their role in like wholesale cross-border payments as well as domestic, what the role is of reputation, whether for gaming or for credit, and the future of finance and what Web3 looks like in the future, and with achieving that right balance of discoverability of information and privacy preservation in the future of payments. Thank you guys for all of your views here. I know we've run over time, so thank you, Shinichiro. If you want us to take any questions, but I think we've gone over, so we probably have to hand over to the next panel. Is that right?
Okay, I have there's one question from remote participant. That should be
Sure.
fine. So Ken-san, can you speak up for your question? Please make it very quick.
Ken?
Yes, I want to make a question, and I think Masaki has already answered personally on the cross-border networks because of the networking effect of some kind of the private sector has kind of overwhelmed of compared to the certain jurisdictions. So perhaps we might want to discuss in the further panels of the scale of the existing kind of competing networks. Perhaps the stablecoin could be another one, but the existing brand international brand network is somewhat the challenge to the one sovereignty. But I found that the Masaki has mentioned, I have a comment. So I think perhaps it is time for him to comment on it.
No, thank you. But because the time is running short, so I don't need to comment now. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Fantastic discussion, and I'll turn it over to Professor Matsuo.
Thank you very much.